Yesterday, in an outcome that almost no one would have predicted 6 months ago, Zohran Mamdani won the election to become mayor of New York City. Mamdani's meteoric rise has triggered a fair bit of interest from not just the Democrats, but also struggling left-wing parties across the world, who are all wondering what they might be able to learn from his sudden and unexpected ascendancy. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what Mamdani, who describes himself as Trump's worst nightmare, but has been described by Trump as a 100% communist lunatic, might be able to teach a discombobulated Democratic Party. We've just released a brand new coffee table book called Assembly Required, which runs through the stories behind some of the world's most beautiful parliament buildings. It's 300 pages long, features hundreds of photos, as well as custom designed floor plans and maps, all alongside the stories of each building written out by our team. Find out more and pick up a copy by clicking the link in the description. So before you start on us in the comments, a quick caveat. Obviously, there's only so much you can infer about what the Democrats should do at the national level from an off-year election in one of the most liberal cities in America, when the opposition was Andrew Cuomo and Curtis Sliwa. Furthermore, the lessons that the Democrats ultimately draw from the Mamdani experience will probably depend more on how he fares over the next few years than on how he fared at yesterday's election. If he does well and remains popular, he might well be seen as the inspiration for the next generation of Democrats. If he crashes and burns, he'll most likely be framed as a cautionary tale. Nonetheless, with those caveats in mind, we still think there are at least 4 tentative lessons that the Democrats can draw from Mamdani's recent successes. Besides the really obvious ones, like be better at social media and don't have establishment vibes. The first, though, is that focusing on affordability and inflation works as an electoral strategy. For context, there's currently an ongoing debate within the Democratic Party about whether they should focus on the threat that Trump apparently poses to American democracy or more bread and butter issues like the price of eggs. Advocates of the first approach argue that focusing on affordability looks trivial when Trump is, in the eyes of many Democrats, tearing at the fabric of American democracy. Whereas advocates for the second approach argue that voters care more about bread and butter issues like inflation, and polling does suggest that this is Trump's weakest issue. According to Nate Silver's polling aggregator, for instance, Trump's net approval rating on the issue of inflation specifically currently sits at -30, roughly 20 points below his personal approval rating. Moreover, they worry that focusing too squarely on Trump's assault on democratic norms make Democrats look like they're defending the status quo, which isn't a great look in the current political climate. Obviously, these aren't mutually exclusive, and the Democrats could attack Trump on multiple fronts, but there's a debate going on within the party over which to prioritize. Mamdani's success suggests that focusing on affordability is probably a good idea. Mamdani's campaign focused relentlessly on cost of living issues, and while he wasn't afraid to take positions on so-called culture war issues, they weren't the primary focus of his campaign. More specifically, Mamdani spent a lot of time talking about the exorbitant cost of housing, and while many economists were skeptical as to whether his policies would actually work, voters apparently appreciated his focus on the issue. And this would be consistent with international experience too. In the Netherlands, for instance, the Liberal D66 party won a shock victory against Geert Wilders' PVV, and not coincidentally, their campaign focused heavily on easing the Netherlands' housing crisis. It's easy to forget, but there was even a moment during the start of Kamala Harris's campaign when she was really foregrounding her proposal for a $25,000 tax credit for first-time homebuyers, which has polled well and probably helped her eke out a narrow lead against Trump in the early days of her campaign. Anyway, the second lesson is that politics can be more positive. Mamdani's campaign was undeniably positive. He was relentlessly optimistic, always smiling, maybe a bit too much, and trying to have friendly conversations even with people who disagreed with him. For instance, Mamdani formed an amiable electoral alliance with Brad Lander during the Democratic primary a couple of months ago, despite their disagreements over Israel. Mamdani, for his part, argued that Israel should not be a, quote, Jewish state, while Lander describes himself as a liberal Zionist, and unlike Mamdani, unequivocally denounced the phrase globalize the Intifada. This is why it doesn't really make sense to describe Mamdani as a populist, as the media sometimes does. Populists are generally pretty negative, framing politics in zero-sum, us versus them terms, and are very willing to define certain groups out of their electoral coalition. Again, international experience suggests that positivity in politics can work. In the UK, for instance, the Green Party's recent rise is often chalked down to the optimism of their new leader, Zach Polanski, who wants to, quote, make hope normal again. The third lesson, though, is that explicitly left-wing economic policies are no longer the electoral liability they used to be. For decades, Democrats have been terrified of the socialist label in a country that has, at least until recently, liked to see itself as a bastion of capitalism. Mamdani, however, is a self-described democratic socialist who said that he doesn't believe in billionaires and has endorsed a number of left-wing economic policies, including raising the corporate tax rate, making buses free, freezing rents, publicly funded childcare, and even creating a handful of state-run grocery stores in an attempt to bring down food prices. And none of this has proved as electorally fatal as you might have once expected it to. This is both because persistent inflation has made Americans more open to government solutions, but also because adopting radical left-wing policies can help burnish a candidate's anti-establishment credentials, and their pro-establishment vibe is arguably the Democrats' biggest electoral liability at the moment. This is presumably one of the reasons that Bernie Sanders, despite being an avowed socialist, has consistently enjoyed some of the highest approval ratings in Congress. The fourth and final lesson is about the Democrats' leadership. The Democrats are currently fretting, for understandable reason, about their lack of leadership. Most senior Democrats are pretty unpopular at this point, and the party doesn't have an obvious presidential candidate to put up against the Republicans in 2028. The bookie's favourite is currently California Governor Gavin Newsom, but while Newsom is clearly a savvy politician who could plausibly win in 2028, he's far from a shoo-in, and Republicans are optimistic that they'll be able to frame him as a West Coast lefty out of touch with quote-unquote real Americans. Mamdani's sudden ascendancy, however, should remind Democrats to chill out. There's still lots of time for fresh faces to emerge, and forecasting their presidential candidate in 2028 is pretty much impossible. Just look at Mamdani. He was essentially a complete unknown only a couple of months ago, and is now a household name internationally. To some extent, this has always been the case. In 2005, for instance, very few people thought that Barack Obama, who'd only just been elected as a senator, was going to be the next president. But it's become particularly true in the social media era, where going viral, as Mamdani sort of did, can transform a politician's fortunes almost overnight. In fact, in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, we discuss this exact phenomenon, with a whole article about how Mamdani and others hacked social media to win elections. It's not just that, though. The main story in the next issue is what we're calling the New Middle East. In it, we run through each country in the region and discuss their future, before reflecting on how recent events have reshaped the Middle East forever. We obviously talk about the Middle East a lot in videos, but this is our most zoomed out, detailed and thought through coverage yet, truly outlining how we see this region re-emerging. It's not just that, though. There have also been a lot of major elections this year. So in this issue, we have a whole section talking about all of the major elections that have taken place this year, and how global politics has changed. China's continued dominance, politics in the UK, and how politicians have hijacked social media. This latest issue is now available for pre-order on our website, and as always, subscribing will get you 20% off not only this copy, but also every future copy as long as you're subscribed. Plus, this time round, we're also offering bundles with our book Assembly Required and our 2026 calendar. For instance, you can subscribe to Too Long and get a copy of the book for just $43.99, or add a calendar to your subscription for just a few pounds more. Anyway, click the link in the description for all of the offers, and thank you for supporting the channel.